This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we head into 2024 now with two major rulings on maps in two critical swing states, that's Michigan and Wisconsin. Can you give a rundown of what happened in these states?
Yeah, these are huge. Particularly the case in Wisconsin is blockbuster stuff. So we saw in Wisconsin the state Supreme Court strike down what has to be the most gerrymandered map in the country. This is the state legislative maps, the maps that from which they choose their state legislators. And in a sweeping, absolutely stunning, absolutely blockbuster ruling, the Wisconsin Supreme Court said those maps violate the state constitution under a theory that they include non-contiguous districts, and that will lead to a redraw. In Michigan, a much more conventional case, but a very important one. A three-judge federal court there struck down the state legislative maps, mostly around Detroit, saying that the maps that had been drawn by that state's redistricting commission were impermissible racial gerrymanders. So two really big cases, Brian, to start the new year, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year. Okay, so what impact can new legislative maps ultimately have on congressional maps?
So there's nothing immediate that's going to happen as a result of these for either of the congressional maps. There have to be new lawsuits, and we don't know whether those new lawsuits will come to be or not. I'd be keeping a close eye, everyone out there. Keep a close eye on Wisconsin, where you have very, very gerrymandered congressional maps also. And look, Brian, you and I talked about the importance of the Protasiewicz election when the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin was up for election, when that seat was up, and what it would mean to go from a 4-3 conservative majority to a 4-3 liberal majority. And we have seen it now in this big blockbuster state legislative map, but I suspect we'll see it in other kinds of cases. And like I said, everyone out there ought to stay tuned and see what we see in the congressional maps.
And of course, if we have any updates on any lawsuits about the congressional maps, you can find that information in Democracy Docket. It's the free news outlet Mark founded to focus on everything voting in elections. I'll put the link on this screen and also in the post description. So again, any updates, you'll find them there. Mark, Democrats had already gained a trifecta in Michigan. So what does it mean that Michigan's legislative maps will now be redrawn?
Yeah, so that's why I say it's an important case out of Michigan, but not nearly the blockbuster it is in Wisconsin. Because in Michigan, as you say, it's a majority Democratic state legislature in both houses. Obviously, the governor is also a Democrat. I think what you'll see is a redraw that will correct the way in which Detroit principally was drawn as it affects minority voting rights. Essentially, the redistricting commission there adopted essentially a numerical threshold or cap of sorts, a target for Black voters that violates the Constitution. It's a racial gerrymander. It'll lead to redrawn maps, but you're basically talking about Democratic seats being drawn one way or another. That's not to minimize the importance of them, because obviously Black voting representation is important. Complying with the Constitution is critical, and we have lots of those cases around the country. But I don't think you're going to see a huge partisan effect, and that's quite different than what you may see in Wisconsin.
Okay. Now, will both of these states' maps be redrawn in time for 2024? And I guess as a follow-up to that, is there anything that Republicans can do to either stop or delay this decision?
So look, there is a freight train coming down the track at the Republican legislature in Wisconsin, because the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin made absolutely clear that the legislature and the governor can draw new maps to remedy these violations, but that if they can't get it done, this court is going to draw a map, and it's going to be in place for 2024. And there is nothing the Republicans in Wisconsin can do to stop that. This is the end of the road. State Supreme Court governing the drawing of state legislative districts. There's nothing for the U.S. Supreme Court to do. And so one is going to assume that the Republicans in Wisconsin will act in bad faith in the legislature where they control, but the governor will veto what they do. And so we will get fair maps that could very well mean the breaking of the Republican majority in the state legislature in Wisconsin. In Michigan, again, a much simpler process here in that you have a trifecta. So we will see what happens in terms of the redistricting commission trying to redraw these maps with the state legislature, or ultimately the court. But I don't anticipate any blockbuster change in the overall composition. For that, I think we really need to be focused on Wisconsin.
Okay. And does the precedent that's being established now in Michigan and Wisconsin impact any ongoing cases or lawsuits in any other states that do have gerrymandered maps?
Look, I think that the Wisconsin case only has precedence in Wisconsin, but I think it is a very, very important tell. It is a very, very important indicator as you and I go throughout the next year, as all of our viewers go throughout the next year, and in the very important swing state of Wisconsin, ask where does the court see its role? What does the state Supreme Court see its role as, whether it's for a future case around congressional district redistricting, or whether it's about voting rights or abortion rights? And, I focus on this because the Republican legislature threatened to impeach a justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court to try to engage in intimidation. Let's be honest. They were trying to intimidate this new liberal majority from acting appropriately and applying the Wisconsin Constitution in a sensible way. And they got back down. Those impeachment threats, those removal threats, they've disappeared. So I think what it says is that we're going to have a court now in Wisconsin at the Supreme Court level that is going to do the right thing around democracy issues and hopefully other things. In case of Michigan, anytime you see a precedent building around racial gerrymandering, you have to look at this pending Supreme Court case, for example, out of South Carolina, where we're awaiting a decision. And, every time a federal court stands up for minority voting rights, it builds a little bit taller a wall against future abuses against racial gerrymandering and deprivation of minority voting rights.
Well, to that point, are you expecting the court in Wisconsin, for example, to issue more pro-democracy rulings ahead of this 2024 election?
Oh, I think there's no question. I think that, this is a critical state for democracy. It is a critical state, not just in the presidential, it's a critical state across the board. Like I said, I don't want to get ahead of myself with respect to any congressional challenge that might be brought to the congressional map, but that obviously opens up as an opportunity. But there are a half dozen or so voting rights cases that are pending before the state courts in Wisconsin, some of which could get to the state Supreme Court. There are, as you know, critical cases involving abortion rights that will wind up weaving their way up to the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin. And of course, we will undoubtedly see, Donald Trump and his thugs engage in voter suppression and other tactics that will involve the state courts in Wisconsin. So I feel better about Wisconsin than I have in a very long time.
And let's finish off with this, Mark. If any plaintiff brought forward a case challenging Wisconsin's congressional maps, is there any way that could be adjudicated before 2024, or would something like that, even if it started today, would that probably be looking ahead toward 2026?
Oh no, it could be done for 2024.
Okay.
Again, I don't want to be predictive here of anything, but what is sometimes complicated for people to understand is they hear this thing about the Purcell doctrine where courts say it's too late. That is a federal court doctrine. That is a doctrine that says that there's a point in time in which the federal courts will no longer change lines or no longer change election rules. That is not a state court doctrine. I mean, some state courts can adopt it, but it is not practically too late, and I would not expect the Wisconsin Supreme Court to apply an arbitrary cutoff like we have seen, unfortunately, hamper redistricting efforts in past cycles elsewhere in the country.
And would a challenge to the congressional maps happen in state Supreme Court then, in the state court system in Wisconsin?
Again, I don't want to.
Could I guess the question should be could that happen?
I don't want to be cagey here, but look, federal courts have jurisdiction over federal claims. State courts have jurisdiction over state claims. If there is a map that is passed in any state, and we'll just say that more generally, any map that is passed that violates the state's constitution, the state Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of that. You remember last cycle, we saw the North Carolina Supreme Court strike down that state's gerrymandered maps. In New York, we have been talking a lot about what the state Supreme Court is doing in applying that state's state constitution. And there's really very little that the federal courts or the U.S. Supreme Court could have to say about that. So stay tuned.
Okay. And of course, like I mentioned before, if we have any news on Wisconsin congressional maps or any other news with regard to voting rights, again, sign up for Democracy Docket. It's the news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting in elections. Link is on this screen. It's also in the post description. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.